We fight Wall Street in the workplace. We fight Wall Street on the waterfront. We're not just going to picket in front of the bank. We're going to stop operation.
This discovery that the people can express their will, and when they express their will massively, they can impose their will.
The only time that indigenous people ever changed the course of Australian history was at the Aboriginal Embassy in 1972, and that came about because of mass action.
Pilger, so I'm very proud and very pleased to announce John Pilger speaking at Marxism 2013.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for coming. It's become an annual pleasure for me to come to this great conference, and so I'm very appreciative to those like Tom who have organised. I wonder how many of us here today have just tweeted or retweeted or texted or checked Facebook. Perhaps some of you are doing it now. I wonder how many of us spend much of our waking lives monitoring a device we caress in the same way that devout Catholics caress their rosary beads. And I wonder how many of us have considered the way we've allowed ourselves to be distracted, and how we've become unwittingly obedient to a power with old and familiar aims, but in a new and very potent form. Let me put it this way. When the powerful want to control us, the first thing they do is appropriate our political will to change the world. They do this by distracting us, by concentrating our behaviour on the superficial, but most of all by directing our energies inwards, to ourselves. This was called in the United States some years ago, meism. In reality, it's a form of entrapment, a means of isolating and dividing people, of hijacking their causes and eventually pacifying them. I'd call it a kind of digital slavery, a wired state that Edward Said once described as an imperialism that could go where armies and navies could never reach, an imperialism of the mind. Perhaps it offers the ultimate means of social control because it's voluntary, addictive, and shrouded in illusions of personal freedom. Of course, technology on its own is not the problem, but it has provided the pretense of political change. When a new Apple smart device arrives in the shops, it's like a revival meeting. In all the tributes paid to Steve Jobs, I struggle to find any mention of the conditions of the workers in southwestern China that brought you your Apple smartphone and your iPad. Women and men forced to work and live in hideous conditions, some of them committing suicide in despair. For many who should have known better, this company has become almost a cult itself. The propaganda says that so-called social media has brought us together. In fact, it's often driven people apart, encouraging us to embrace single issues that are introspective and confuse politics with lifestyle. Above all, by creating a false sense of solidarity online, it's often helped us to abandon real solidarity. And solidarity is the key to changing the world, isn't it? Solidarity makes people hard to control and prevents us from becoming the objects of private power, of falling victim to a false moral zeitgeist, the kind that has some feminists believing that a woman running Westpac or the IMF is progress, the kind that promotes to the gay community the belief that same-sex marriage is more important than the enduring exploitation of ordinary people, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual preference. In Britain, the Parliament has just passed the gay marriage bill, a Parliament dominated by perhaps the most reactionary, regressive political force in Britain's modern history, a government determined to dismantle the National Health Service and undermine public education, led by a Prime Minister who says that imperial war could go on for decades. That's the word he used, decades. The same Prime Minister, David Cameron, is all for gay marriage. Why? Well, he's a former PR man. He knows it's a hot issue, a sexy issue, an issue that is constantly on the news, an issue that distracts from his government's vicious attacks on the living and working conditions of the majority of people. He knows that many in a sizable gay minority will now vote for it. At the very time the gay marriage vote was taking place, a bill was passing through Parliament that introduces secret courts to Britain. These are modern star chambers designed to protect torturing, lying, security and intelligence services, especially those of a foreign power, the United States, the people who gave us Guantanamo Bay. At the very time the gay marriage bill was becoming law, a commission of inquiry found that a quarter of the people of Greater Manchester were now living in, and I use the words in the report, extreme poverty, the direct result of Cameron's policies. At the very time the gay marriage bill was being celebrated with street demonstrations in central London, David Cameron was selling weapons to the regime in Sri Lanka, which uses rape as a method of torture. Of course, people should be able to marry each other regardless of gender. But understanding how social issues can be hijacked under the rubric of human rights is vital if we're to combat the great wrongs in our societies and create true solidarity. The same is true of anti-racists who believe that electing a man of colour as President of the United States is an advance. Obama's two great achievements are the silencing of the American anti-war movement and the destruction of constitutional protection for whistleblowers. Truth-tellers like Bradley Manning, whose heroic actions we depend on more than we realise. The same is true of those anti-war campaigners who believe their proxy alliance with Western power in supporting civil wars, often triggered by Western power, is progressive. It isn't. It's the opposite. For imperial power relies on those liberal and left voices who wring their hands and ask, what can we do, without inquiring who the we is, who is calling the shots, and who is dropping the bombs. The most multicultural nation in the Middle East, Syria, is currently facing its greatest hour of need, and its greatest need is not to be torn apart for whatever sectarian or imperial reason. Last Monday, the New York Times revealed in detail how the CIA was effectively running a full-scale war on Syria, including, and I quote, more than 160 military cargo flights from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar flying into Turkey, described by a CIA official as a cataract of weapons into that country. The beneficiaries include a powerful group allied to Al-Qaeda. This has been planned for 6 years, backed by the medieval regime in Saudi Arabia. To my knowledge, this has not been used in Australia. I'll read you a leaked joint US-UK intelligence file. Quote, in order to facilitate the action of liberation forces in Syria, a special effort should be made to eliminate certain key individuals and to proceed with internal disturbances in Syria. CIA is prepared, and SIS and MI6 will attempt to mount minor sabotage and coup de main incidents within Syria, working through contacts with individuals, creating a necessary degree of fear and disruption. Our invasion through the frontier will provide a pretext for intervention. The CIA and SIS should use all our capabilities in both psychological and action fields and newspapers to augment tension. That was written in 1957. Nothing has changed. The cynicism and criminality is breathtaking, but not surprising. It's no different from the destruction of Yugoslavia and Iraq, the attacks on Afghanistan and Libya. What is certain is that the greatest imperial prize, Iran, is at the end of the road to Damascus. For Iran's unforgivable crime is its independence. Allow me to repeat. Understanding how and why our hearts and minds and politics are hijacked is vital if we are to combat the great wrongs in our society and create real solidarity. Whatever our gender, our race, our sexual preference, our class, what matters to great power is the class we serve, regardless of how the designs of great power are disguised, and whether or not they are called social issues. In the 1970s, I met Leni Riefenstahl, the great German filmmaker whose revolutionary techniques produced a documentary film that mesmerized Germans under the Third Reich and cast Hitler's spell. Some of you will have seen her epic of the Nazi rallies at Nuremberg called Triumph of the Will. When I met her, I asked her about the source of her film's power. She replied that the messages in her film, her word, messages, were dependent not on orders from above, but on what she called the submissive void, again her words, submissive void of the German public. Did that include the educated, cultural, often left liberal bourgeoisie, I asked? Everyone, she replied. Today we prefer to believe there is no submissive void. Choice is unlimited, says the propaganda. And driving this is a so-called digital revolution that assaults our senses, our attention span, and our memory every day, almost every minute of every day. According to Time magazine, we now live in an eternal present. And what matters now are social issues that capture our heart, our sentiments, such as the great stage events like official apologies, the kind that have people crying on the TV news? Who could fail to be moved by the response to Kevin Rudd's apology to the stolen generations? And yet, without reparations, without land rights, without a treaty, without justice for all Indigenous Australians, it meant nothing. No, it did mean something. It distracted people from the essence of the most important struggle in Australia, and the least recognised as the most important struggle. On other major issues, this propaganda of distraction and co-option is everywhere. It's like a white noise. Without many of us being aware, one of its main targets is our memory. Let's take Vietnam. As long as we remember the truth about that seminal horror, we shall understand the horrors visited on the Middle East today, and we won't be distracted. The attack on Vietnam was genocidal. The policy was body counts, free fire zones, mass murder. Men, women and children were given racist terms, such as gooks, digs, slopes. The attack on Iraq was genocidal. The first part of that attack, from 1991 to 2003, has been airbrushed from historical memory. This was a medieval blockade that didn't allow people enough to live on and killed perhaps 1 million Iraqis. According to UNICEF, 500,000 children under the age of 5 died as a direct result. The word genocide was and still is used by the 2 senior United Nations officials who resigned in protest. I remember being in Sydney and watching the ABC News one evening. It was in the 1990s. A naval ship was leaving Sydney to enforce the blockade of Iraq. Women and children were waving goodbye to their loved ones. They were crying, and the news captured these moving moments. Not a word, not a sign indicated the great crime that their loved ones were about to take part in. Not one of those 500,000 Iraqi children was ever acknowledged. Leni Riefenstahl would have been impressed. The second stage of the attack on Iraq from 2003 is known as a war, but it wasn't a war. It was so one-sided. According to peer-reviewed studies, the attack has produced more victims than the genocide in Rwanda. Who knows about that in Australia? In the outer limits of Australian liberal expression, such as the Fairfax Press or the Australian Academy, there is the equivalent of Holocaust denial. Otherwise, the public would know the truth. So when you next look in wonder at your smartphone, or when you next tweet or check your Facebook page, consider that the real digital revolution has happened in silence and secrecy. In the United States, the priority strategy of the Obama administration is the control of cyberspace, the internet, your iPad, your smartphone. In the last 4 years, much of the internet has come to resemble a militarized zone, a means of surveillance on a scale difficult to imagine. According to a rare whistleblower, the National Security Agency in the United States examines every phone call, every internet connection, and intercepts 1.6 billion personal communications every day. This is what is called a national security state, America's gift of the 21st century. Once known as liberal or social democracy, this Orwellian system of power guarantees a permanent state of war, and that the real enemy are not terrorists, but the public at home. In 2010, Twitter was ordered by the Justice Department in Washington to surrender its clients' personal information relevant to the administration's pursuit of WikiLeaks. no matter where in the world people live. In the national security state, we're all Americans now, if we allow. Australia has been integrated into this system. Witness the use of the Australian military as American mercenaries. Witness the collusion of the Gillard government in the pursuit of WikiLeaks and the abandonment of an Australian citizen, Julian Assange. President Obama stands before the Australian Parliament and announces yet another military base on our soil from which America will threaten our biggest trading partner, China, and the Gillard government and the media applaud. How shameful. Before inviting your questions, I'd like to conclude these remarks by referring to a particular Australian silence that's almost a national secret beyond this venue. I spent the last year making a film called Utopia. The title is taken from that vast expanse of red earth east of the Stuart Highway in the Northern Territory. I first filmed across indigenous Australia in 1983 when I made The Secret Country. I've always felt I discovered my own country then, and recently I've had to learn that all over again. I referred earlier to a false moral climate created to distract us from true issues of social justice and state crime, and to co-opt us in their execution. In 2007, the Howard government sent the Australian Army into the Northern Territory. Backed by high-profile journalists, they smeared indigenous communities and indigenous men as pedophiles. The eugenicists and the missionaries and the rednecks were right. The first Australians were by nature degenerate and wicked and needed humanitarian intervention. That was the message to the submissive void of public opinion, and it was a lie. And attempts to justify it by liberals and even some feminists are part of the lie. These people in the media, the academy, politics, often the liberal world, invented a very modern and liberal reason for clawing back the crumbs of political power, the half-baked land rights and the fraud of native title that we gave indigenous Australia. As Tom mentioned, I've been a reporter in many parts of the world. I've made my way through many places of upheaval and suffering and struggle. And I've never known anything quite as dishonest and sinister as the intervention right here in Australia, and which the Labor government has given the Orwellian name of Stronger Futures. As part of this new assault on Aboriginal people, another generation is being stolen. Children are being taken away. In the Northern Territory and in Western Australia, the rate of imprisonment of Indigenous Australians is many times that of apartheid South Africa. Black people. Black children who have been convicted of no crime are being routinely thrown into adult prisons. And the second highest cause of death among Aboriginal men in Australia today is suicide. Think about it. And that has been on the record for years. What I've witnessed is as shocking as anything I saw in South Africa during and since apartheid. And it's not just a bunch of rednecks imposing their will, though they exist, of course, but people who regard themselves as progressive, yet have sold out to the power and propaganda of mining companies. Liberals and feminists for whom the memory of Australia's bloody past has been wiped clean by an empty gesture known as reconciliation. These are the dangerous times we live in. Is Noam Chomsky right when he says that there is no real left movement these days, that people are now atomized by their own special interests? It's an important question. Sporadic, safe protest is not a movement. Standing for a monolithic parliament is not a movement. Is that what radical means these days? And where are the truly radical writers and playwrights and filmmakers? There are an honourable few, of course, but where are the rest, especially in Australia? Now, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that these are times that call for courage and for risks to be taken, for people to stand up together and urgently and now. Thank you.